glad to have you here today. And Catherine gave me an update on two friends, gentleman we've been praying for, Marcos. He failed all of his extubation tests, but then when they were done with that, if you know extubation, taking the tube out and seeing how he does, he opened his eyes, turned his head, looked for Sarah, and made eye contact and reached for her hand and pressed her hand very hard with fingers. So he failed the tests on the medical side, but then he did all the stuff that the test would test for. So glad about that. And Sally, I hereby ban you ever telling me to be clean shaven. Because when I'm only clean shaven for 5 days, you tell me I look worse. So don't ever talk to me again about being clean shaven. And for those who are saying, Brother Brian, she's right, you do look worse. Don't worry, I'm growing it back in as fast as I can. So we are glad to have you though on this Labor Day weekend, and we want to look at a passage, and my goal is as we enter fall, I know technically it's not fall, but let's be clear. Fall is September, October, November. Winter is December, January, February. March, April, May is spring, and June, July, and August are summer. And I wish they'd just change and quit doing this equinox stuff. All right, it'd be so much easier for us. But I want you to have a lesson that on Labor Day, I want to encourage you to take what we're going to look at this morning and look to apply it into your life so that your walk with Christ can be something that blesses you and not something that tires you as far as spiritually and emotionally are concerned. Let us read the Word of God together. Hebrews chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. It says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have come short of it. For indeed the gospel was preached to us as well as to them, but the word which they heard did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in those who heard it. For we who have believed do enter that rest, as he said, so I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works, and again in this, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains that some must enter it, and those to whom it was first preached did not enter because of disobedience, again he designates a certain day, saying in David, today, after such a long time as it has been said, today if you'll hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Jesus, or if Joshua, depending upon your translation, if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterward have spoken of another day. There remains therefore a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience." Now as we come to this passage, I want you to understand that he's talking about a rest, and we're going to look at some of the historical stuff real quick. Verses 1 through 6, he says the good message was preached to them just like to us. You know, we look back at the Old Testament and we say, Brother Brian, that wasn't the gospel. Hey, I got news for you. For a people that were slaves in the land of Egypt, that not only when Moses showed up, but, you know, when the Pharaoh said, you know what, let them get their own straw, let them make their own bricks, and if the tally goes down, I'll beat you all harder, and I'll restrict your food even worse, and I'll make life even more hellish for you. Pharaoh's goal was to make life like hell on earth for those people. And so when Moses shows up and he says, the I am that I am wants to take you to a land flowing with milk and honey, so that the main thing you got to do, wake up in the morning, take care of your flocks, clean your house, and do your household chores, and you'll be blessed by walking in obedience and serving him. Do you understand? That was great news for those people. They would be sovereign. They would be under God, and God would be their only king. And their land would be blessed, and their house would be blessed, and their flocks would be blessed, and their crops would be blessed, and their economics would be blessed. That's good news for a people who were slaves. That's like everything a slave would ever hope for. To be able to live like little kings each in their own house. You understand that's the heart of what the American dream was originally about. Every person having their own land, being sovereign on their own property, being sovereign in your own house, free from the government tyranny. That was the whole point of all that stuff in the Declaration of Independence, y'all. I mean, that's a big part of, the Fourth Amendment, And so for them, it was good news. You say, well, our gospel is a little bit different. Well, yes, our gospel is much better. But for them in their time, that was still pretty good news. But here's the point. God has been preaching a message of good news all along. He's been trying to get people ever since Adam and Eve rebelled to come back to a path where they can be blessed. Hearing must be tempered together with faith. Now, some of you going, yeah. All right, so Forged in Fire is like one of the 10 greatest TV shows of all time. It's a bunch of guys beating metal, making knives, and then chopping stuff. I mean, that's some good television, right? You say, good for you.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen it, Phyllis?
No.
The number of women that I have known that once they started watching that show appreciated the craftsmanship and the science and the artistry and the beauty. They were absolutely taken with Forged in Fire, what those guys could do. It's absolutely gorgeous. And I got news for you. Those are what are called Damascus steel knife blanks, basically. Now, if you know anything about forging or tempering, one of the things they're fond of is taking old leaf springs and cleaning them up and using those to make knives. And what happens is you fold it and you heat it and you pound it together and you keep folding it and heating it and pounding it together. You reach a point where you're never ever going to get them all apart. You can see the striations, you can see the lines, but it's never ever coming apart. It has to be tempered and forged. And I want you to understand that that's what he tells us here, where our faith and our belief are concerned. Remember what it says there, verse 2, it says, it did not profit them because they did not mix what they heard with faith. And the word for mix there means to temper together. Someone can come to church their whole life and never get anything out of it. Why? Because they heard the words, but they never heard it. You have to take what you hear and you have to combine it with your faith in order for it to move you forward in the blessing of God. And that was why those people failed back then. They heard the words, but it never got past their eardrums for all intents and purposes. And so we look at this and we understand unbelief is the failure to temper faith and hearing into one. And in the book of Hebrews, and I'll just skip forward so you understand what I'm saying here. In the book of Hebrews, faith is always taking action on what God says. That's what faith is in the book of Hebrews. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen, or the assurance. Because God said it, they took the action even though they had not seen the finished product. Faith is always moving in action on what God says. And so you have to take that hearing and you have to take that action and put them together to move forward in the blessing of God. So then we look at this second part, verses 7 through 9. Hear, rest, and remain, right? There's still a rest that remains. Listen to what it says again. It says, and he designates a certain day, saying in David. David is 5 centuries after Moses. 5 centuries. I want you to think about that. What if Christopher Columbus had written some stuff down for people in St. Augustine? You say, he didn't go to St. Augustine. I know he didn't. I know Ponce de Leon did. I know at least that much Florida history. I mean, come on, give me a break. But 1492, what if 1492 Columbus says, there's a rest waiting for you. And no one takes ownership of it. And so Governor Rick Perry repeats it again. You say, why is he quoting a guy from 500 years ago? Because there's something good that people are still missing out on, they haven't taken ownership of for 5 centuries. Let that sink in. 5 centuries, and no one had yet grabbed hold of it. When you say, Brother Brian, how could they miss it? How can any of us miss anything? Apparently, sometimes we get so busy, caught up in the wrong kind of work, that all of a sudden we wake up and life has passed us by and we haven't been able to lay hold of half of the things, even a tenth of the things that God has intended for us as a blessing. And that's part of the point I want you to get this morning. I don't want you to do that. Because Labor Day is an oxymoron. All right? On Labor Day, the whole country tries not to work. Right? It's one of those, am I the only, please tell me, Rich. Kevin's not. At least Kevin says, no, it never made sense to me, those words. Right? And you always got in trouble for talking in the laboratory. Right? I'm working and talking. It's a labor oratory, right? But you have to ask yourselves these things, right? 500 years go by and they don't get it. But he says, today. You cannot undo yesterday. It's over. Whatever you did yesterday, whatever ripple effects might carry over from yesterday into today, you deal with those, but you can't undo yesterday. And let's be honest, we don't know if we have a tomorrow. So the only moment that we can be in the blessing of God is today. And that's the boundary. And I want you to think of that as a blessing. As we touched on in class this morning, from the time that Jesus was able to put into words and into thoughts as a person, I wonder when the first realization came into him that as he saw some of those guys hanging on the cross, that he would be one of them someday. Was he 3? Was he 5? I don't know. The burden of the cross was something that was there for a long, long time. Thank God that we don't have that much foreknowledge. Thank God. The only foreknowledge we have is that the moment that we have is this one right now, today. And so thank God there's a boundary. The boundary is a blessing for us because it should encourage us to use this that we have to the best that we can. Joshua. Now, you say, mine says Jesus. If you have the old King James, it says Jesus. I like it. I like it better as Jesus, but I'm fine with Joshua because Joshua and Jesus are the same name. And here's the point in the writer of Hebrews using the word like that is he's telling them, look, the children of Israel, they came out with Moses. They marched around for 40 years. A new generation came up. Joshua took them into the land of promise. But they never entered into the rest. They never had their peace in the days of Joshua because they didn't do what they were told. And you said, well, brother, they had to go out and fight war with everybody. Go back and read what the Lord said about how the fight would go. He said, all you have to do is march out there and just go whack, whack, whack. And he said, and some of your fights, I'm going to send armies of hornets and wasps in front of you to defeat your enemies. Now, how many of you, if you had 10 hornets coming at you, would wave a white flag and yell, I surrender, I quit? And some of you go, brother, I would have won. What if you have a wall that you can't see to the other side, and it goes from one edge of the horizon to the next of hornets coming at you? That's what the Lord said. The Lord said, I'm going to fight for you. And they said, we're not going to go to the battlefield. We're going to let these people be whatever because our house is fine. We really don't care about anybody else's house. And so they never entered in. And he said, what does that have to do with Jesus? There's a ton of things that Jesus accomplished for us at the cross. But until we start to step with him and get in line with him, we'll never move into the blessings he's already attained for us. Because the children of Israel struggled from the same thing that any one of us can fall into. And I dare say all of us fall into it from time to time. And that is we get so caught up in a lot of day-to-day stuff that, let's be honest, about 70% of it doesn't matter. Okay? And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I've had 2 good weeks in a row. Last week it said Sunday morning, you used your phone 2 hours and 23 minutes less than last week. This week it said I used it 1 hour and 34 minutes less. Woohoo! That means I gained back 4 hours of my life. Woohoo! You said, well, that's over the whole week, brother. What does your phone say that you did? Okay. You say, well, yeah, I know there's a point, but, I'd laugh at your mama, Kendall. And your grandmother, right? If Kendall texts him, he answers right away, but us, he may wait 6 hours. Well, you were a new number. Now that you're in my phone, you can wait too. Now, what's the point? Just because the texts come in. Fine if you have certain people in your life that you need to give them a higher priority because, kids or whatever, or parents, but you know what? Most texts, and I want y'all to think back. Now, you youngsters have no clue what I'm fixing to talk about, and that's okay. There was a time when us elderly folks rode dinosaurs to school, and we had phones that were attached by cords. Now, some of you go, Brian, I remember those days. Do you remember that when you were driving or you were at the grocery store or somewhere else, you know where you were when you were at the grocery store? At the grocery store. People had things happen in their life when you were at the grocery store and nobody could tell you about it back in the day. Did you know it's okay, other than your spouse, your kids, your grandkids, right? I'm not telling you, don't answer them for 4 to 6 hours, because you have to go home to some of the same buildings with some of them. Okay? But other than that, you realize most texts and most emails can go untouched for 6 or 8 hours? And did you know the world will still function? Don't let this rob you of your relationships with people, and don't let this be the thing that becomes your master and takes you away from your God. This is the greatest threat to your faith that you've ever had, because it will eat your day and your life up, and at the end of the day, you'll look at your list of 10 things to do today, and you won't have even hardly got one of them done. No, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter what they got caught up in. They had stuff that they had never had before. They went from being slaves to being a people with land. They went from marching in circles in the desert to having water and crops and cattle and all that stuff. And they got so hung up that they finally had something that they said, now we don't have to do what we're told. And so for 5 centuries, they had warfare and chaos in their country because one generation would not settle down and enter into the rest of the Lord. So he says, therefore, there's a rest that remains. And I want you to understand what he means by rest. Right? God rested on the 7th day. But Jesus says, my Father has been working since the beginning, and I work. The rest for the Lord means this. There are some things that God does that once he's done, he's not doing that same thing ever again. That's what he means when he says rest. And I want you to start to look at and think about your Christian life that you have in Christ, that there are some things that, frankly, we need to let go of. I mean, thank you, John Calvin and all the other Protestants, for guilt-tripping everybody into works salvation while they said it was all about faith. Let that one sink in, Rich. The whole world revolves around works because a guy told everybody it was only about faith. And they've all missed it. And they've all missed it. Because look at the next section. Ceasing from our works. Now this is an interesting one in verse 10, because if you read through the rest of the book of Hebrews, you'll find that Jesus is the one who's entered in, past tense, into everything. That what Jesus did on the cross, he did once, it's good for all time, there's no need to ever repeat it. So verse 10 is, since Jesus has entered into the Father's rest, Jesus himself has also ceased from his works, just the same as the Father did at creation. In laying the groundwork for the new creation, everything that Jesus needs to do has already been done, and now Jesus is at rest in the Father, and he's administering his kingdom for the benefit of his children. And I need you to understand this morning, because this plagues people. Over the decades, the number of people that have been Christians when they spoke to me longer than I've been alive now, who never entered into rest. Ronnie, I've talked to a few 80 plus and 90 plus year olds out of baptism. Because they would say to me, I got baptized when I was 10. I didn't understand as much, and I know death is getting near. I think I need to be baptized because I'm not sure I was ever really saved. And I asked them, you've been a Christian for 80 years. What you been doing the whole time? And they said, well, I know so much more. And I said, well, I'd hope that you would know so much more after 80 years. I said, I ain't been a Christian as long as you, but I understand that I didn't know anything when I got baptized. But what I knew was right, and I was obedient to what I knew. Now let that one sink in for a moment, will you? What you know, if you know it's right from the Scripture, and you're obedient to it, no amount of future knowledge will ever change that what you did in that moment was good, period. This is why we don't baptize people every time they, commit gross sin. Gross sin. Right? Someone gets baptized, 20 years go by, they've been a drug lord, an alcoholic, they've murdered 900 people, and they've had 400 girlfriends and 300 concubines. But they got baptized when they were 10. You say, brother, I think you need to baptize them again. I don't think the first one took. No, the first one was fine. Why? They never learned to enter into their rest. Do you understand that what Jesus did at the cross was good for all time? The moment you were baptized into Christ, you entered into the rest that he already purchased for you. This is why he says to us in verse 11, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest. But he already said to us, back there, right, in verse 3, for we who have believed do enter that rest. We're already in the process of our rest. We're already on track with it. He says, here's the key thing. Don't fall according to their example of disobedience. The moment you were baptized into Christ, the moment you united in his death, his burial, and his resurrection, there was nothing more you would ever be able to do to be right with God. There was nothing more you would ever be able to do to be more justified. You can be more sanctified as you grow in maturity, but you'll never be more justified. Never will. Okay? Yeah, you like the word y'all in big caps. I like it too. Evan, I'm just going to pick on you. If you can do 3 cartwheels and 4 somersaults right now, did you know it will prove that you are more Evan Thomas Hand than you were before you did it? Will that actually prove it? Or will it just prove that you are amazingly skilled at gymnastics and none of us knew how skilled you were? That's right. And I'm not going to ask you to do that, bud, because I don't want you to make the rest of us feel bad with your gymnastic ability. All right? But what I just said to Evan, I want you to think about the doubt that continues to creep back into hearts and minds at various times in our Christian walk. It's the same doubt that the devil tried on our Lord. If you're really the Son of God, I'll never be more God's child right now. I'm not more God's child now than I was the day I obeyed. What he did then was good for all time. I'm his child because he made me his child. I'm not his child because I earned it. I'm his child because I was obedient to what he said. I heard, I obeyed, and therefore he made me. I don't have to work now to be his child. He did the work, I obeyed it because that's what he said to do. Therefore I received the blessing. You say, but what about the works we do have to do as a Christian? Well, let's think about them. And let's think about the actual works. All right, for those of us who grew up, and some of you all remember this time. I know people had good intentions, Brother Rich. I know they did. You know, if you're a Christian, you won't get drunk. If you're a Christian, you won't fool around with a bunch of women. Well, what if it's a few? You say, no, I didn't. When the first time I heard it, I didn't think that. Later on, I did, because I thought, this is bad logic here. If you're a Christian, you won't steal. If you're a Christian. So you set my entire identity based on what I don't do. But you haven't told me how to actually be what you've told me I'm supposed to be. And I remember the first time that came to me. I wish I remember the day, but I remember in my head going, this is backwards. Just because I don't do the bad things doesn't mean I'll ever become the right thing. And so then I had this ridiculous notion that if I did enough right stuff, that would somehow make me the right thing. And then I ran into this passage. And here's the beauty of this passage, and here's what I want you to take. I do the right things because it's what He's already made me, because I want to be more like Him. I'm not doing the right things to be more like Him because I'm trying to get there for myself. He's already made me what I am, and now I'm doing the right things to fulfill His trust in me. It's a totally different reality. You say, but Brother Brian, Christians still shouldn't. Okay, the church has changed. Years ago, I could say Christians should never drink alcohol, and everybody would go, amen, even if they drank, right? I'm going to say Christians are not supposed to be given to drunkenness, ever. But will that still make me sober-minded? Someone asked me one time, they said, how did you give up alcohol, Brian? I said, it's easy. I developed a Dr. Pepper and coffee habit. I said, no amount of coffee I ever will drink makes me drunk. No amount of Dr. Pepper I ever drink will make me drunk. And they said, don't you think about not drinking? I said, I wasn't until you and I started talking about it. I said, now I'm thinking about all the ways drinking made me feel. I said, so now I'm going to go and I'm going to drink a lot of coffee today because my arm wants to bend. I said, so I'm going to drink a lot of coffee today. They said, why do you focus on coffee? I said, because I can focus on what I don't want, which increases the probability that I'm going to go back to it. Or I can focus on the things that keep me in the place that I want to be. And then I don't have to think about what I don't want. I want to ask you that about your Christian life. Are you working to try and make God happy or make God feel good about you or to satisfy yourself with some kind of attaboy for what God's already said, or attagirl? Just like Evan. No matter what Evan does, he will never do enough gymnastics to convince me that he's Evan Thomas Hand. All the testimony I need comes from two simple places. His mom and his dad. They say he's Evan Thomas Hand, therefore he must be. Their decree is what makes it so. My decree will not invalidate it, and him doing tricks will not make it more so. Now, if I were to ask him, what makes you that in your family? What is the standard there? He might tell me. Because there's a standard for how we're supposed to be in that family. But what makes us what we are is fixed. And as you go back out into this week, as you take time tomorrow, own that you're God's child. You will not be more God's child by what you do. But unless you do what He's given you to do to be like Him, you'll never enter into the fullness of His rest. And here's why. Because till you start to become like He is, because that's who you want to be, the fight between your flesh and your spirit will keep you from ever having the peace and the rest that you desire. But the moment you decide, this is what he says I am, and therefore that's what I'm going to become, because that's what he says I am, and that's what he says he made me, at that moment, the world loses all of its ability to ever manipulate you again. And in that moment, you have rest and you have peace from what's external conflict, because now you have peace within you with him, because his purpose is your purpose. If you're here today and you need to become God's child, will you come? Always stand. Always.